This lesson is going to be all about deconstructing assignment and the deconstructing assignment syntax in the JavaScript expressions that makes it possible to unpack values from arrays and also objects into distinct variables. So we've got some examples of within an array, how to deconstruct the arrays, how to deconstruct objects, how to deconstruct the returned results from a function, and then output on the page. Then we're going to practice what we've learned using an object with an array inside of it, and then outputting that content into the web page. Then lastly, we're going to take all of that, put it together, use the object deconstruction in the output of the page content, and also move the contents over to a JSON file and make a fetch request to that JSON file in order to output the content of the JSON file directly within the web page. So that's all coming up in this lesson. Let's get ready to code. Hey, let's have some fun with JavaScript. So I've got the index.html file. This is just a standard HTML file. I've got one div there, and I've got a script linking out to code2.js. So that's going to be the main JavaScript file that we're going to be working with. So going over to code2.js, and you can create your file, your JS file, link it to your HTML so that it will run within the browser. The browser that I'm using is Chrome. I've got the DevTools opened up here on the bottom right-hand side so that we can see output coming from the console into the browser window. And we'll do let A, B, C. So declare the variables that you want to use. And now let's assign some values to A, B, and C. And the values that we're going to be assigning, so this is going to be an array, so as long as the structure is the same, we can make use of the values. And now if we want to output the values for A, B, and C, then we can do it this way. So that will output the values that are coming from the array and then outputting them as the deconstructed values that are assigned to the variables. So let's create an array, and this can be const. So our array will have the 3 items, and then we're going to assign A, B, C to the value of the array. And we notice that output into the console is still going to be the same. So we're still going to get the 5, 10, 15, which is going to correspond to the index values of the items in the array. So what happens if we have another one, an additional one? There's still going to be 5, 10, 15, because it's going to take the first 3 items in the array, assign values to them. So what happens if we have different values like a D and an E? So what do you think is going to happen to D and E as we don't have 5 within the array and we're trying to assign values to 5 different variables? So when we do that, the last one, even though it's a declared variable, there's no value that's assigned to it, so it's just going to return back undefined. So that's going to be the expected output is going to be undefined. And what if we have an array with a ton of additional values and we only want to have a certain amount of variables? So let me update this to 20, 30, 45, and 50. And then let's declare an array. I'll call it array 1. So if we want to assign the values to array 1, then within the console, let's go ahead and we're going to output array 1 into the console, and that's going to result in the 30. But what if we want 30, 45, and 50 to be assigned to array 1? So the first 5 items within the array are going to go to the variables, and then the 6th item within the array and onwards, we want to just simply send over to the new array that we've created. So we can do this with the deconstruction by adding in 3 dots. So what will happen now is array 1 will be set to 30, 45, and 50. And if you want to output those values of array 1, you can output them now using the index values that are going to correspond to the index values that would have been after the first 5 that are assigned when we do the deconstruction. So this is where we can output 30, 45, and 50, and then we can select the items within that new array that we've created using the index value. So now we've tried it with arrays. Let's try this with an object where we want to assign certain values to the object. So the same thing that we just saw over here, where we can set up a deconstruction. So using the rounded brackets to contain the contents of the object, And then we're going to have one object is going to equal the other object. And we're going to assign to the values, and let me just declare a few other variables, so f and g, so we can use those within the object. So if we have f and g as the variables that we want to use, and for the objects of f, and this is going to have a value of 100, and g is going to have a value of 200. So let's try to output those. So this is now using an object, and we're going to output the values of f and g into the console. So what values were you expecting? We see that we get 100 and 200, so those values are getting assigned to that object. What if we change these to a and to b? What happens? We get undefined, because this is looking within this current object for the property name that needs to match with the property names of what we're assigning. So when you are using the objects, make sure that you assign the property names that are going to also correspond with the ones that we're using for the variables. And that will allow us to output those values and assign those values into that object. So now if we look at f, the value of f is going to be 100. And just as we saw with the object, just as we saw with the array, so if we had an h, I, and let me set some different values here, and we want to simply assign to the rest of the remaining variables whatever that value is that we want to use, this is where we can create an object. So I'm going to create the my object, and then use the comma and then the 3 dots to assign the remainder to the my object. So if we console log out my object, what do you think the output is going to be for my object? And if you said h 300, I 400, and j 500, you're correct, because just as we saw with the arrays, the 3 dots are going to indicate that we're collecting the rest of the object content into that main object container, just as we did with the array. You're probably wondering, okay, well, what if I have a function that's returning some values? So let's try that out, where we've got our function, and the function is going to simply return back some values that we can then also use within the deconstruction and assign to the variables using the JavaScript code. So the content that's going to be returned back is going to be an array, and within this array, let's have some values, so 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. And then using the deconstruction, let's create a couple more variables. So last time we left off at g, so let's do h, I, and j. So declare the variables first before we try to use them. And then now we can assign values to those variables. So if we want to do it within an array format, just as we did earlier with the array, we can simply assign the results of invoking the function fun. And using the console log, let's output the results for h, I, and for j. So output that into the console, and we see we get the results of 10, 20, and 30. So if, for instance, you don't want to return back and use all of the values that are contained in here, so what if we only want to do 10, 30, and 50? So that way, if we wanted to, we would just have to have a blank comma, and then now whenever we run the function, now we've got 10, 30, and 50 being returned back in the console as being assigned to those variables. So what happened when we do have the comma and the missing, it actually skips it and ignores the value. So in this case, it'll be doing 10, it'll skip 20, then do 30, skip 40, and then do 50 in the response back as we're deconstructing the object variable. Now we're ready to put it to use. So let's say we've got a person. So this is going to be an object. And within this object, we might have multiple people, or actually I'll just update this to people. And then we'll have multiple persons within this an array, and we'll have multiple values here that are going to be listed. So let's create a value, and first will be Laurence, and then for favorite is JavaScript, of course. And also let's add in an ID of 100. So when we output that into the console, when we output the people object into the console, we get the person, and let's say we've got a few people that we have. So we've got the first name, and let me do a quick update. So that gives us a couple people that we've got within the object. And what we want to do is we want to take that object and we want to loop through the people array. So let's use for each. And then as we've got person, we want to output the results of that person and output that into our HTML page. So selecting the page object with a class of output, that's where the contents are going to be output onto the page. And then as we loop through, and we can update the inner HTML, so just add to the HTML using the template literals. So those are the backticks to the left of the 1 key on most keyboards. Now we can select person, and then we've got the first name and then last name. And this is getting rather long, so let me update the view to the word wrap. And let's also do the ID and person.id. So that's outputting the people onto the page. I'm going to set this within a div. So it's giving us the people being output onto the page. I'll make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. So that gives us that output. We've learned with the object deconstruction is that there's actually a simpler way to manage the output. We can use the object deconstruction in order to create that output. So in order to clean up the output that we're building, that we're outputting onto the page, let's update this code so that we can use a deconstruction on the person and clean up some of the code that we've got here. So let's assign to first, and using the same format where we've got the object that we're declaring, and to first, last, and ID, we're going to assign the person object, and that's going to get deconstructed. So that will allow us to simplify some of the code that we're using here as we're iterating through and outputting the content. In addition to that, we're going to go and create some HTML. And that HTML is what we're going to use in order to wrap the content that we're constructing. So first we'll move that whole line of code there. And then HTML, we're going to simply be adding that HTML object. And let's create a container that we're just given a name of div using the document create element. And the element that we're creating is going to be a div. And the contents of that div, and this is going to be for the div object. So div text content is going to be what we had here within the original content. Instead of adding the inner HTML, we're going to be simply appending the div to the main parent element. So that's going to provide us the same output, but it's going to create the code in a much more readable format. And so now let's finalize this. We're instead of having the object here, we're going to import this from a JSON file. So we need to convert this into JSON. And JSON, the difference between the JSON object and the JavaScript object is with the JSON, you're going to need to have the double quotes around the property names. So I'm just adding in those property names so that we have a valid JSON file. And then we'll use fetch in JavaScript in order to request this data object. So once you've got a good JSON file, it's a valid JSON file, I'm going to comment out this content here. And I'll just move down. And we'll set up our JSON file. And that's going to be the JSON file. And this is going to be sitting on the same folder that I have my code.js and my index.html. And of course, we need to have the correct path to the file. Now let's add in an object event listener. So using the add event listener, and we're going to fire this off when the DOM content loaded. And we're going to load a function called getData. And this is where we're going to be making the fetch request. So getData is going to run when the DOM content is loaded. And within here, the getData, we're going to make a fetch request and then return that response back. And we know that the response is actually coming back as JSON. So we can deliver it within the promise as an object and chain together. Once we retrieve back the data from the JSON file, we'll send that over into a output generating function, which is going to be the one that's going to be output and generating the output for the page. So output gen, and this will take in the people object. And I'll just indent this one line and close off that request. DOM content has loaded. We're going to run a function called getData, And actually, it should be loading to JSON file. So it's actually JSON 2. So let's save that again. So once we've fixed all the errors and the issues, we should be able to see the output. And now this output is actually coming from the JSON file. So if you make any updates to it, that will also update the content that's being output onto the page. It's making the fetch request to the JSON file. And then once the file makes the connection, it gets the data, uses that data, sends it over to a function that's going to generate the output using the object deconstruction in order to output the content onto the page. So go ahead and try it out to get more familiar with what you can do with the deconstruction assignment syntax in JavaScript.